channel. Thank you for continuing to support the channel. If you like this video and if you like the other videos I make on this channel, please continue to subscribe and recommend this video and other videos in the channel in general to your friends and family. In this video, I will address the topic of Instagram and the problem of the selfie in particular, but social media more in general, in that it intervenes with the natural process of sort of the transcendence of the ego. That is, the ego's descent into the complexes, and via the complexes, the archetypes that are at their fundament, and the way that basically, and then the following subsequent rise. That's why transcendence, the descendance and the transcendence, and the following or subsequent rise back into its own linearity, changing sort of the horizon on which it exists. And I will do so by first briefly outlining sort of the structure of the ego that we've been, or the structure of the psyche, that is, that we've been addressing in other videos in the Jungian context, in Jungian terminology. And then second, addressing briefly the structure of Instagram and the structure of the selfie in particular, and the effects, the amplifying effects it has on the ego. And then finally addressing how these mechanisms of social media and Instagram in particular change the dynamic of the ego in its interaction with the unconscious in general, with the collective unconscious in particular. So let's begin. And we've discussed in many videos, and I'll put some links here, that essentially in the Jungian framework, we can imagine the psyche to be composed of three layers. You have on the level of consciousness, you have the ego, which essentially acts as a story, a narration that explains who I am today, who I was yesterday, and who I will be tomorrow. And that story is constructed as a linear story. It's an interpretation, and it's a story as in it exists to be communicated, to be told to someone, and that someone could be myself, could be others. In the case of others, this may be then also referred to as your persona that you employ in a certain situation. Even in the communication with myself, that may be the case, but that is always grounded in this general interpretive framework of the ego, or as Jung calls it, the central complex of the psyche, the Ich complex, so the central complex of the psyche. Central complex of the psyche implies that there are other complexes, and indeed, there are many other complexes. A complex is an autonomous psychic factor. That is, that it's an autonomous bundle of information that you have gathered over time and that is clustered around a certain core. We'll get to the core in a minute. But the complex, for now, is sort of this bundle of information. You can imagine it as a planet in the universe, where information that is similar in its type or in the problems it addresses has gathered. And in essence, you have many of those complexes that represent everything you have encountered in your life, right? And there's a central complex, however, that acts as an interpretation of the other complexes, which you can then refer to as the Ich complex, right? The I complex, or the ego, right, in short. And that particular complex, essentially what it does is it builds a story to understand all the other complexes. In doing that, it obviously reduces their complexity immensely. You know, you have all these complex, as the name implies, complex encounters, interactions, informations, all entangled in a web of what I refer to as debt. So a web of, let's say, interrelations between you and places you've encountered, you and people you've encountered. So basically everything you have used and referenced in constructing the complexes that you carry with you over time and build over time, continue to build on over time. And those people in turn have on their part, constructed their understanding of certain elements that you've encountered them in, or moments you've encountered them in, let's say, in reference to other people. So they have a certain interpretation of an element, of a piece of information, and you have an interpretation of a piece of information. And when we say interpretation, we always mean a step on the ladder of the ego, if you will. You know, a cobblestone on the path that the ego constructs. So interpretation is not related to the unconscious complexes themselves, right? Because they exist in, let's say, relative neutrality. And that is, they exist autonomously and they exist independently of you and your existence. That is, they exist autonomously, right? And I call this space the space of the collective conscious. Jung doesn't use this space explicitly, although he hints at it in his collective works, The Dynamic of the Psyche, Dynamic of the Unconscious, I think it's called. Yeah, not sure. Not entirely sure. But collective works 9, I think. But in essence, it's collective because you have certain elements or pieces of information. Let's say the smell of a perfume, right? It's a relatively neutral element, and different people have a different interpretation and a different claim on that element. So you have, let's say, you met a girl, a woman, and she used a certain perfume, and that perfume left a certain mark on you, as we would say, right? It has a certain, you build that brick into your ego in a certain way, based on, and that is what exists on the level of the complex, the actual momentary encounter with that perfume, and everything that was around it with it, maybe a kiss, maybe a look, whatever it was, right? Maybe a conversation, something platonic, whatever it was, And so in essence, this particular moment in which is the actuality of the sort of the encounter, let's say, in which this specific information was indexed into your complex, right, into your unconscious. This moment doesn't exist as a non-temporal sort of removed from time and space and context moment, right? But it exists as a concrete moment in time, with concrete entanglements to other people, right? Maybe this woman, the perfume of this woman was given to her by her lover, and you don't know about. Maybe it was given to her by her father and it has a completely different meaning. Maybe to her it has no sexual connotation that it has to you, but it has a connotation of paternal violence, like I don't know, whatever it is. The point is that you don't possess the power to know exactly what this interpretation is about. But your ego, nonetheless, builds its linearity, builds sort of the pathway it builds, it constructs the cobblestones, it builds the path of that you walk on every day, because, essentially you can imagine the ego as the vehicle you move forward with, because precisely this vehicle, right, this narrative body, as I call it, right, is sort of the protective layer that allows you to even create a future and a past and a present, right? Because in order to have a future, you need to project yourself into the future. If I don't know, like if I don't have an expectation of what's going to be tomorrow, there is no tomorrow, concretely. Like I don't need to save any bread or money. There's been studies, very interesting studies, on saving behavior. People have extremely difficulties saving money. It's very, if you save a couple €100 a month for a lifetime, and you save it beyond your own lifetime, so let's say you save €100 a month, to take a very low amount or whatever it is, and you save it not for 50 years, right? Like most people, well, that's already a challenge, saving for retirement 30, 40 years, that's a challenge. But then if you save for 50, 60, 70, 80 years, 90 years, let's say, until after your death, essentially, with the trajectory not to give your children money, but your grandchildren or your grandchildren, your grandchildren will very likely be multimillionaires, if not billionaires, right? If this goes on for two centuries, right? You know, whatever, however you set that up in the trust fund setting or whatever it is, however you ensure the money is being sent and not spent, right? It's an extreme wealth that you can build over the generations, right? But no one does it. No single person does it, or barely anyone does it, because we're so irrational that we can't even imagine living the next day even. Well, some struggle too. But this is precise psychological, right? You have this struggle to build this linearity, basically further than a certain projection horizon, right? And this is what your ego essentially does. Your ego defines, and the narrative that you build about your ego defines the horizon, based on which you can approach others, can approach essentially reality, right, if you will. But so those are the two levels, right? The ego interprets and thereby subjugates the meaning of the elements that the complexes are made of. Okay. Now, it's important to note when we're going to discussions of Instagram in a minute that the complexes retain their autonomy, and that this logic of debt, and I made a video on debt, you can find it here, I'll link it somewhere, and also put it in the video description, but this logic of debt essentially functions in a way that if you now encounter this other person, this woman with the perfume, and she tells you, oh, this perfume doesn't signify anything sexual, actually, what it means to me is like my father gave it to me, forces me to wear it every day, whatever, you know, and you know, she's like 30, and you're like, what the, you know, and that'll, depending on how fundamental this information, so the sexual connotation of this perfume that you smelled at a specific moment, and the, you know, subsequent or interrelated assumption that this woman had some kind of interest in you, particularly related to that perfume, scent, whatever, depending how fundamental that is to the general narrative you build, you know, across your ego, base your ego on, the new information you learn that this has nothing for her, she doesn't like you, blah, 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 you know, it'll more or less rupture the stability or the integrity of your ego, right? I made a video also on trauma and rupture, and you can find it, again, I'll link it somewhere, bottom, top, right, left corner, whatever. It's in the video description as well. So what this rupture essentially does is it creates a gap in the narrative of your ego. It takes out a cobblestone, a stone from the path that you've built, right? Takes it away. And so there's a gap now. And again, depending how fundamental this information was to the integrity of the whole, this will be problematic or not. You know, maybe you can just, it's just a bump in the road, you can just sort of just ignore it kind of thing, or you can sort of drive around or whatever, metaphorically speaking. But if it's fundamental, then what happens is you're essentially, well, first of all, libido is drawn, or psychic energy, as Jung calls this, is withdrawn from that specific element. So you feel a certain emptiness, a certain nausea almost, you know, melancholia, nauseatic melancholia, let's say. But secondly, you need to fill that gap, right? It's sort of, you're thrown into a depression, you're thrown, as text by Elizabeth Dunn, and one cancer patient describes her diagnosis, which is essentially nothing else. You know, the probability that you have a certain disease it's mathematical, right? You can, if you were rational, you would not be surprised to have a certain disease, because it's a mathematical equation. It's like, I am X likely to have Y disease, you know. But yet, the assumption that we have stable, functioning physical bodies is a psychological one. It's essentially, it's based on the integrity and stability of the ego, right? Where it's fundamental to the stability and coherence of the ego, of the narrative body as a whole, of the movement towards the future, right? And so particularly Elizabeth Dunn describes the diagnosis of cancer patients and their experience of this diagnosis psychologically, and one of her patients says, it was like being thrown in a cement mixer and shaken around, and then just left there, and you don't know what's going on. And so, at a very fundamental level, such a rupture is experienced as a fall, in a way, as a descent. And this descent, and this is quite interesting, is a descent into the attempt to reconstruct who you are in the absence of this precise assumption. So you may know this. What happens when someone breaks up with you, or you're sad, or someone doesn't text you back that you expected to text you back, to return to the example of this relationship kind of thing. Maybe you'll go to old text messages and you'll be like, oh no, let me just scroll through those text messages and make sure that my assumptions about her were right. Or you go to old pictures. Often, we go to old pictures. Often when we experience, I've had this. I don't know if you had this. Comment and put in the comments if you had this. But when you feel this moment of doubt about something you're doing, you're like go back to old pictures, or listen to old music, or you're just kind of trying to remind yourself, oh, this is who I actually am. It's essentially, I think that's what's going on. I don't know, but I think that's what's going on. It's like, oh yeah, this is what's going on. This is who I am. Never mind. And I almost forgot myself, kind of thing. I think that's, what we're trying to do here, I think, and this is sort of narrative psychology speaking, is we're trying to reconstruct the story that we've built of ourselves over time. So we're trying to reconstruct, essentially, who we have told ourselves we are, referring to the artifacts that we have built. But it goes deeper, right? Because this moment of rupture essentially prompts us to go back. It prompts us to reconsider ways to fill this gap. And we may discover new elements to put in the gap's place, new ways of interpreting a certain experience, new exposures that we had, anything that'll change or shift the ego's horizon. There's this story that Jung has in his Mysterium Conjunctionis, where there's a king, and the king supposed to go to war, or on a hunt, I'm not sure, war or hunt. He's a very bloodthirsty king, and he's thirsty, and he asks his servants for water, and he drinks more and more and more and more water, and he drowns himself, essentially. And now what happens is he's dead, and his servants are like, what the hell is going on? And then what they do is they put him in a sauna so he can sweat all the water out, and then they cure him with the salts and other medications and so on. And then in the end, he has to return, sort of drink water again, I think, or the cure in the end is wet, I believe, if I remember this correctly, because you have to you can only heal the wound with the sword that created it. I think that's from the story of the what's the English translation for it? The story, the Nibelungen. Let me see. The Ring of the Nibelung, Wagner's. I think that's from Wagner. Well, it's the translation, The Ring of the Nibelung. Interesting. I didn't know. Well, you can only Die Wunde kann nur heilen, das Schwert, welches hat sie geschlagen. Something along those lines. The wound can only be healed by the sword that produced it. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if that's from Wagner, if I remember this correctly. But in a way, that's sort of telling for the cure. You cure wetness with wetness in the end after you dried it. So essentially, you descend and obscurum per obscurium ignotium per ignotium, something like that. It's the saying of the alchemist: insanity through the insane, obscurity through the obscure, something like that. And so this figure of the descent, this figure of the heating, the figure of heat, this calcination in a way, is a process of or resembles a process of psychological depression. So a process, you withdraw sort of the psychic energy further and further out of the body in order to heal, to descend into precisely what has produced this gap or this wound, to fill it again, And so here it becomes interesting that at the core of the complexes, so you have the complexes as the sort of the flesh, and the bone around which the flesh is wrapped is actually in the Jungian context the archetype, and the archetypes thereby create the trajectories or the grid along which the complexes can be organized. So it's the background of the world, if you will, the background of everything, determining precisely how the experience that we have can be clustered and organized. And ultimately, I mean, in the interpretation, at least, of Stevens and sort of this sort of naturalistic, let's say, school, and of the interpretation of these archetypes, that it's an evolutionary problematic that we're facing, right? It's simply to say the cognitive structure that we're made of has evolved in a way that it clusters information according to very ancient patterns of the world, let's say. So ways we've always encountered the world, and according to those, information is structured. There's a particular, let's say, cluster of complexes, with at the core they have sort of the female archetype, the mother archetype, associations with motherness, something like that, and that could be qualities like warmth, when you experience a warmth. Like for me, I have an affinity for blow dryers, for example. I have a blow dryer here, and so it's a fun piece of information, right? I'll always, sometimes when I have to focus really intensively, or I attempt to get into sort of a focusing moment, or I just need comfort, I turn on a blow dryer. And that does nothing else than sort of the warmth of a mother's arms, or the womb in the end, right? And so that would be sort of the clustering of that information, right? The blow dryer association, the complex around that. However that's developed, I have no clue. Well, I have some clues. I can build chains of association, but I won't do you that burden. But so that clusters around sort of this, at the core is this warm female archetype, right? Mother archetype. And so the idea is that archetypes can actually, from the core, emulate upwards, so they can break through towards the ego. But since the archetype, very important information, the archetype has no form, it's shapeless, it's formless, it's pure, it's trajectory, it organizes, it creates gravity around which stuff could cluster, right? It's like a magnet, but it itself has no content. So basically, the archetype provides the psychic energy that energizes the breakthrough or the breaking through of certain information from sort of the complex layer into the ego, and then rupture the linearity the ego has created. So I hope that makes sense. So you have the complexes can be activated on two levels, essentially. In the logic of death, they can be activated through the encounter, or what I call the negative judgments. You encounter someone else and they're like, no, your interpretation is wrong. I've never loved you. I've hated you, actually, whatever. I don't care about you, and you're like shattered. And then in addition to that, if you had an anima projection onto that person, however that worked, this encounter with the person would sort of prior to that information been charged with the constellation of the anima archetype in that specific moment, which would again provide psychic energy to the complexes surrounding that specific archetype, whatever those are. And in the moment of that encounter, all these complexes would be activated, and the person would inferior their negative judgment, and that would break into your ego, infected with that sort of that energy, that psychic energy, and basically shoot a hole into that linearity, which would prompt you then to descend and try to figure out what's going on. And you don't only try to figure out, and this is the really important point, what's going on, particularly with this woman and her perfume and whatever, just get over it, ideally. But you can descend into these chains of association that I was referring to. It's not only about the blow dryer. There's a story to it. There's associations with it. It's chained up in clusters of association, right? around these archetypal sort of cores that are all activated in a specific moment. So an encounter, a negative judgment, encounter, I call it encounter or negative judgment that causes a rupture, prompts you to consider not only that particular element, but the entire associations or clusters around that element, which help explain why you were so obsessed with that damn girl and her perfume, or why I'm so obsessed with the damn blow dryer, essentially. Sorry. And so it opens the possibility again to move the horizon, to speak with Wolfgang Iser, literary theory, of your interpretation of those complexes, so of the ego. Let's get to Instagram. So I'll try to keep this brief because I'll make other videos on Instagram. It'll be interesting to know what precisely you would like to know. I mean, it's well, it depends like how much into the sort of the theory of the image and the selfie and so on, and the platform itself would be cool to go. But so essentially the argument is this: on the platform you create a space where the negative judgment is circumvented. So you create a space in which basically based on the logic of the like button, you have a perpetuating formation of filter bubbles, to use the term of, what's his name, Byung-Chul Han, in which basically everything you see is more or less the same. So an algorithm will not present you something that is entirely a term that's frequently used, right? This is telling that I'm forgetting it, of course. Confrontational would be a synonym, but that's not the term I'm looking for. Offensive, that's the term. Of course I'm forgetting offensive, right? This whole idea, it's the sort of the dream of political correctness is social media, essentially, on the microcosm level, right? Because the algorithm, again, presents you only with that which you want to see, because otherwise you wouldn't spend more time on the platform. So, but here's the thing, and this is so interesting, I think, psychoanalytically. If you really enjoy interacting with people that offend you, right? You have this sort of this trait. You like to sort of interact. You really spend a lot of time commenting and whatever, watching those videos that you actually hate, or that get you going, kind of thing. The algorithm will show you those more, right? So it's not that there's this sort of fluffy moment where you only see cat videos and dogs and pretty, I don't know, pretty gardens or whatever it is. I like gardens. It's pretty interesting to look at gardening and architecture. But the algorithm will show you where you spend your time most, or where you spend most time, the maximum time, whatever. And so the idea here is really that this particular interaction, so even this hate interaction, this seeming apparent friction, precisely fits into what your ego wants to see. What continues to build the strength of your ego's interpretation of the complexes. It doesn't threaten the ego, because the ego, with every rupture, the ego is threatened to fall apart, right? In its sort of central interpretive framework is threatened, right? If you suddenly have cancer, it's like, shit, my fundamental assumption, sorry, I wasn't supposed to say that, hopefully YouTube won't cancel me. My fundamental assumption of who I was is now broken, right? And and the algorithm doesn't want that, because then of course you're not going to come back. And the ego doesn't want that, because of course that's very uncomfortable, right? Obviously. And so what happens is it'll show you precisely what strengthens what strengthens sort of the boundaries or the walls of the castle you have built, representing yourself or whatever. And this is precisely the problem, because here we lose track with this negative moments of negative judgment. And as we have seen in this very elaborate first part of this video, I'm sorry, is that these moments of rupture, of negative judgment, are precisely the moments that drive us to, again, broaden the horizon of the ego's interpretation of the complexes. They draw us to understand who we are in the context of what humanity has always been. That's always how I try to explain Jung. So what he's attempting to, right, is prompting us to understand who we are in the context of what humanity has always been, right? That's the archetypes, the second part, right? And whereas I think ego psychology, like someone like Freud or Lacan or whatever, they prompt us to some extent, and please hang me for that if you want, but it's essentially attempting to construct. It's the first part of individuation, right? The first half, which is find a place in society and exist in it with minimal friction, which is building a strong and coherent ego, essentially. But returning to Instagram, so the problematic, it inhibits or it prohibits almost this transcendental movement. It prohibits this descent into the complexes and via the complexes into the archetypes and the surrounding sort of structure as a consequence of the negative judgment, by creating a space in which negative judgment is avoided, or I would say structurally repressed. It's better. And so the selfie plays into that, of course, and this is another level in a way. The selfie plays into that by helping us create an image of ourselves that complies precisely with this logic, right? It's if the algorithm is kind of like automatically creating a selfie of ourselves, right? It's essentially understands how we spend maximum time on the platform and thereby suggesting us content, and the selfie is simply us attempting to and conversely, sorry, just to build the bridge, conversely building a pretty accurate representation of the structure of the ego that we have, the interpretation of the ego that we have built, so exactly what we want to see, right, with all its repressions and all of that, and all its sort of intricacies in a way that I want to be hurt. That's what I like, I want to be. It's not that I'm, like if you get suggestions of videos how to be skinnier, it doesn't mean you're skinny. It doesn't mean you're on a great way and you're really just losing weight and everything's going well. No, it means watching those videos makes you feel like crap. But that's precisely why you always watch them, because otherwise you wouldn't spend so much time watching them. You know what I mean? And so the algorithm is really a good psychoanalyst in a way, and the selfie is too, because it's precisely, the selfie has so many dimensions, and we can talk about that in the context of philosophers and stuff like that in other videos if you want, if you're interested. And I'd be interested to know if you are interested in it, so please leave a comment below, and we can interact, and I can produce more stuff, and that'll be cool. And also, don't forget to like this video. I said it in the intro, and subscribe and share it with others, so we can share the word and inspiration, have more comments and more interactions, and that's cool. But the point is that the selfie has a lot of dimensions, right? It's like, it's a process of staging yourself. You stage yourself, and even if you don't use filters, but it's how do you hold the camera? What do you wear? What's your hair look like? What's your background? What's your whatever? What phone do you use? What are you showing of the self? Like all these things signify a certain meaning. And they don't exist independently, but they reference other selfies that have been taken before, other movements. They, in fact, or in short, they reference a certain, again, filter bubble, if you will, right? A certain algorithmic cluster, right? Or multiple of them, but they then fall into one again. So because it's profiles, right? It's sort of the algorithms are profile or type driven. Like they're not. Don't think they care about your individuality. Like there is none. They're like, there are a lot of people in the world, and you're not individual whatsoever. Like there's nothing about you that's unique, on the big scale, or barely anything. Very un-Jungian thing to say, but it's true, right? I think. And these algorithms can pretty concretely identify that, right? They can pretty accurately type you and thereby recommend certain content. And the selfie, in essence, is just referencing precisely that. So the selfie you're taking has been the same kind of selfie, not the same selfie, obviously. Like there's no second person with my name living in my town doing the stuff I do, obviously. But the type of stuff I'm doing and the type of town I'm living with the type of name I have and so on and so on, that exists a lot of times. And same goes for selfies. And with that reference, what you essentially do is you feed the algorithm and your own representation of yourself precisely with an understanding of the cluster that your ich complex is formed of. So with the ego that you have constructed essentially. And so it's quite interesting. The danger here, and there we come to the third part, which kind of we've already covered. So it's actually, sorry, there's only 2 parts of this video. I'm withdrawing something, so now you should feel disappointed and not subscribe. But I'm urging you, please subscribe anyways, because I can give you some more interesting information, which is I'll now add it. I took away a third part, I'm now adding a third part. Because we've already talked about, the ways that Instagram essentially then cuts out these negative judgments, thereby taking away the possibility for this transcendental movement, right? But now the bonus I'm giving you is I'll tell you about some of the consequences or some of the stuff that may happen as a consequence of this disappearance of this transcendental movement on an individual level and on sort of a cultural level. And this is an interlude, of course, to more. We have to talk about this more, but this is complex. But on a personal level, individual level, obviously, the problem is that the ego becomes more and more stiff. It's self-affirmed over and over and over again, right? It lives in its own bubbles. Thereby, the problem is that reality continues to exist. You will continue to encounter situations where an archetype is constellated and where a debt is reinforced. That means there will be situations where negative judgment and thereby ruptures of the linearity of the ego will occur. These situations become less and less because we spend more and more time on social media. Now, what happens is the ego becomes very stiff and hard. It's like it becomes inflated. Hubris, as Jung calls it, increases. What this means is that essentially in the cycle of individuation, circle cycle of individuation, hubris is preceded, the fall, so the descent of the transcendental movement, the descent, it's a circle, right? Transcendental movement, I'll post a picture somewhere in this video, but it's a descent. Descent, ascent, descent, ascent, descent, ascent, and so on. So descent, transcendence, descent, and so on. And that's essentially the cycle of the hero's journey, right? Basically, you have hubris at the top of the circle, build towards the hubris. You have the fall, you have a rupture here, which is sort of in the hero's journey, it's the encounter with something that's so large you cannot reach it. It's sort of the barring or if you will, it's the no, right? Okay, you thought you were this strong, well, you're not. You thought you were powerful enough to interpret this smell the perfume, you're not, you know. And this precise moment causes then the fall and the necessity to descend, um, which has all kinds of, you know, then this entire interaction comes when you interact with the complexes, you interact with the human history, the archetype, and so on, and you find your guide, which is just a representation of the human history and so on, and then you ascend again, and you come back to your culture in this sort of hero's journey description, which is simply to say you come back to a narrative that has been built, which is your culture, your ego, whatever it is, and you integrate whatever you found, the treasure, you sacrifice the treasure to the collective, which is sort of you bring that which you found, so the new horizon you found merges with the old horizon that's been there. You give the new horizon. It's a very important gesture, but you give this new horizon, you give it away, you sacrifice it, so you don't hold on to it, which you couldn't, but you give it away, you sacrifice it. And the horizons merge. What happens now, again, is hubris, because you then again think, wow, my God, now I've made it, now I know the way, it's all good, and whatever, everything's, now I've gotten over this cold, and I'm healthy again, and finally, you know, I'll be free and everything will be good. Well, everything will be good until the next flu season, and then you get sick again. But if this negative judgment doesn't occur, what happens is you fly higher and higher. Hubris gets worse and worse. Your ego gets harder and harder. You more and more come to think that you can actually control your destiny. And that is difficult, because if you actually think you are in sole charge, like you are the one that is 100% in charge of your destiny, you're psychotic in a way, right? I don't know if this is the accurate diagnosis. I'm not a clinician, but you have to ignore so much of reality to think that you're in control of your own destiny that it does propose the question whether you're not detached from reality in this state of hubris, which you are, because if you say reality is the complexes and the archetypes below them, then in the state of hubris, you're only existing on the level of the ego, which has no actual connection to those complexes and the archetypes below them, except by virtue of this rupture, then you are disconnected from reality. So this is precisely what's at stake if we're taking away this element of negative judgment, which we're doing on social media to a large extent, or I think probably to the full extent. And we can talk about the consequences in more detail in other videos. A great way to think about them is by reading Joachim Teveleit, who wrote about, he analyzed the literature and diaries and so on, records of what would later become soldiers in Nazi Germany, and they wrote in Weimar Republic, so before the emergence of the Third Reich, and then during the Nazi times as well. So you analyze their writings and their descriptions of the war, and it's very, I think, telling in this context to read that. So we can do that in another video, sort of look at those consequences in detail. But I think this video now gave us a good start and a good understanding, a good feeling of sort of how this dynamic works out, and how sort of this natural transcendental movement of the ego can be disrupted by modern culture and other influences. Thank you very much for watching. Again, please consider to subscribe and like this video and share it with your family and friends. See you next time, and thank you very much.